Imagine going to work every morning in the same old Toyota Corolla. You rent a modest apartment. You wear ordinary clothes. You bring lunch from home. Your co-workers assume you're just getting by. Some even feel sorry for you. 2 million. No flashy cars. No designer clothes. No mansion. No social media posts showing off properties. For 13 years, one county recorder lived what looked like an average financially struggling life while quietly building millions of dollars in real estate. And here's the part that makes this story so fascinating. The secret wasn't that he earned an enormous salary. It was that he had access to information most people didn't see until it was too late. He knew which properties were in trouble. He knew which owners were behind on taxes. He knew which properties were heading toward foreclosure. And while everyone else was looking at what he owned, he was paying attention to what other people were about to lose. But there was another secret. He didn't want anyone to know he was becoming wealthy, because he had learned something many people discover only after they lose money. Looking rich and becoming wealthy are two completely different games. This is the story of how he played the second game. And stay until the end, because when the portfolio was finally professionally appraised, even the people closest to him couldn't believe the number. 2 million. But let's go back to the beginning. He worked in a county recorder's office. To most people, it wasn't exactly an exciting job. It wasn't Wall Street. It wasn't Silicon Valley. There were no huge bonuses or glamorous business trips. He was simply surrounded by paperwork, property records, deeds, liens, tax documents, inheritances, and foreclosure filings. Every day people walked past the same information without paying much attention, but he started noticing patterns. A property owner would fall behind on taxes. Another property would be tied up in inheritance. Someone else would stop making mortgage payments. A property might sit neglected for months, and eventually some of those properties would become distressed. Most buyers would discover these opportunities only after they appeared on the open market. By then, investors were competing against one another. Prices could rise, the easy opportunity was often gone. Prices could rise. The easy opportunity was often gone. But his job gave him something extremely valuable: time. He could recognize problems before the average investor knew they existed. And that became his advantage. He wasn't looking for luxury homes. He wasn't chasing the newest developments. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was looking for situations where a property had potential, but the owner had a problem, and he understood something important about real estate. Sometimes the opportunity isn't in the property itself. Sometimes the opportunity is in the circumstances surrounding the property. The first property wasn't spectacular. It wasn't the kind of house someone would post on Instagram. It needed work. The neighborhood wasn't trendy. And if you had walked through the front door, you probably wouldn't have thought you were looking at the beginning of a multi-million-dollar portfolio. But he wasn't thinking about appearances. He was thinking about numbers. What could he buy it for? What would repairs cost? What could it realistically rent for? What would the property be worth after improvements? And most importantly, could the property eventually pay for itself? He started small, very small. Instead of spending every extra dollar on entertainment, expensive clothes, or a better car, he kept his personal lifestyle almost painfully simple. His co-workers noticed. They saw people around them upgrading their lives. One colleague bought a luxury SUV. Another started wearing expensive watches. Someone else moved into a larger house. And whenever the conversation turned toward money, they seemed to assume he wasn't doing particularly well. He didn't correct them. That was intentional. There is a strange psychological pressure that comes with looking successful. Once people think you're successful, they expect you to maintain that image. You buy a better car, then you need a better house, then nicer clothes, then more expensive vacations, and eventually your income increases. But your financial freedom doesn't, because your lifestyle has grown with your paycheck. He wanted the opposite. He wanted his net worth to grow faster than his lifestyle. So while his co-workers were upgrading what people could see, he was upgrading what nobody could see: property, equity, cash flow, ownership, assets. He kept driving the Corolla. He kept living modestly. And when someone asked why he hadn't moved up in life, He simply smiled, because they were measuring the wrong thing. But there was a problem. As his portfolio grew, his name could eventually become connected to more and more properties. And he didn't want attention. He didn't want co-workers discovering that the person they thought was barely getting by had quietly accumulated multiple properties. So he began learning about structures that could separate his personal identity from property ownership. One strategy involved using land trusts and legal entities where appropriate. Instead of putting his personal name directly on every property, ownership could be structured through separate entities. Now, this is important. The point wasn't to hide illegal activity or avoid taxes. It was about privacy, organization, and asset management. He worked with professionals and followed the applicable laws. But the practical effect was powerful. His co-workers didn't have an easy way to look at his name and immediately see the full picture. And that allowed him to continue living quietly. Think about how unusual that is. Every day he worked in the same building. He sat around the same people. He heard co-workers complain about rent. He listened to people discuss mortgage rates. He watched colleagues talk about how expensive everything had become. And he knew something they didn't know. He wasn't broke. He was building, slowly, quietly, relentlessly, but building. Slowly. People judge what they can see. A relative might wonder why you don't seem more successful after working for so many years. And relationships can become complicated too. Imagine dating someone who believes you're financially unsuccessful. They see your modest apartment. They see your old car. They see you choosing inexpensive restaurants. They don't see the assets sitting quietly in the background. To them, you're simply someone who hasn't figured life out yet. That can hurt. Because sometimes the hardest part of building something quietly is knowing that people may misunderstand you while you're doing it. But he kept going. Then came the next phase. He realized that buying properties was only the beginning. The real power of real estate came from what happened after you acquired the asset. A property could appreciate, the mortgage balance could decline, rental income could help cover expenses, improvements could decline. Rental income could help cover expenses, improvements could increase the property's value, and over time, equity could build. That equity could potentially be accessed through appropriate financing. So instead of selling every property when it increased in value, he looked for ways to use the equity responsibly to help acquire additional assets. This created a cycle: buy, improve, rent, build equity, refinance when appropriate, reinvest, repeat. Not recklessly, not overnight, and certainly not without risk, but consistently, not overnight, and certainly not without. This is where many people misunderstand wealth building. They think the secret is finding one magical investment. It usually isn't. The real advantage often comes from compounding. One property becomes two, two become three, three become several, and years later the person who looked like they were moving slowly may suddenly appear to have moved very far. But the truth is, they didn't move quickly. They simply refused to stop. For years, his co-workers saw the same man, same car, same modest clothes, same quiet personality, same apartment. Nothing seemed to change, but behind the scenes, his financial statements were telling a completely different story. The properties were appreciating, mortgage balances were changing, rental income was coming in, equity was accumulating, and the portfolio was becoming larger. Yet his lifestyle remained almost exactly the same. Why? Because he had learned one of the most important financial lessons there is. You don't have to spend wealth to prove that you have it. And that's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because society often rewards visible consumption. If someone pulls up in a $90,000 vehicle, people assume they're doing well. If someone lives in a huge house, people assume they're baiting it well. If someone lives in a huge house, people assume they've ate it. People assume they've made it. But none of those things tell you their net worth. A person can look rich and be deeply in debt. Another person can look ordinary and own millions in productive assets. The difference is simple. One person is financing an image, the other is financing assets. At one point, someone close to him criticized his lifestyle. They couldn't understand why he worked so hard but seemed to have so little to show for it. The comment stayed with him, because technically they were right. He didn't have much to show, at least not publicly. But he had never been interested in showing it. He wasn't building wealth for applause, he was building it for freedom. Years passed, 5 years, then 8, then 10, then 13. By this point, the portfolio had become something much larger than his original goal. The properties were spread across different areas. Some had been renovated, some were producing rental income, some had increased dramatically in value, and the equity had compounded over time. Still, almost nobody knew. Then one day he decided it was time to find out exactly what everything was worth, not what he hoped it was worth. Not what an online estimate suggested. He wanted a professional appraisal, so the properties were evaluated. Market conditions were considered. Compuruticid were analyzed. The condition of the buildings was assessed. Income-producing potential was examined, and the numbers were finally put together. When the final valuation came back, the figure was staggering. 2 million. 13 years earlier, he had been buying distressed properties that most people overlooked. Now, the portfolio was worth millions. And here's the fascinating part. He still drove the Corolla. He still lived modestly. 2 million portfolio. If you passed him on the street, you probably wouldn't give him a second look. And that's exactly how he wanted it. But there is an important lesson here. This story isn't telling you to copy someone's exact strategy. Real estate has risks. Property values can fall. Interest rates can change. Rental properties require management. Taxes, insurance, repairs, vacancies and financing costs can destroy a bad deal. And using legal entities or trusts requires proper legal and tax advice. The deeper lesson is about how you think about money. Ask yourself this: are you spending money to look successful? Or are you using money to become financially stronger? Are you trying to impress people who may forget what you bought 6 months from now? Or are you building assets that could still matter 10 years from now? Because there is a huge difference between looking wealthy and becoming wealthy, and sometimes becoming wealthy looks incredibly boring. It looks like driving the same car. It looks like saying no to things your friends can afford. It looks like investing when nobody is watching. It looks like keeping your expenses stable even after your income increases. And sometimes it looks like being underestimated. If you're enjoying this story, take a second to hit the like button. And if you enjoy real lifestyle financial stories that reveal lessons about money, wealth, and decision making, subscribe to the channel. Most importantly, tell me in the comments, would you rather look wealthy today or quietly become wealthy over the next 10 years? I'd genuinely like to know your answer. There is another lesson buried inside this story. The county recorder didn't simply have access to information. He knew how to use information differently. Thousands of people could see the same economic environment, but they didn't see the same opportunities. That happens everywhere. Information alone isn't enough. You need financial literacy. You need patience. You need discipline. And you need the ability to distinguish between an opportunity and a trap. A distressed property isn't automatically a good investment. A cheap house isn't necessarily a bargain. A high rental yield isn't necessarily safe. And borrowing against equity isn't automatically smart. The numbers have to work. The risks have to be understood, and the strategy has to match your financial situation. But perhaps the most powerful lesson is psychological. He didn't need other people to believe he was successful. That is a surprisingly difficult skill. Most people want recognition. They want someone to notice the new car. They want compliments about their clothes. They want people to know they can afford the expensive restaurant. But financial wealth doesn't require an audience. In fact, sometimes an audience makes wealth building harder. Because once people know you have money, expectations change. Family expectations can change. Friendships can change. Dating can change. Even your own behavior can change. You begin feeling pressure to maintain the image. The county recorder avoided much of that pressure by never creating the image in the first place. 2 million appraisal. However, the secret couldn't remain completely invisible forever. People who had known him for years began realizing that they had misunderstood him. The man they thought was financially behind wasn't behind at all. He had simply been playing a different game, and that realization can be humbling, because sometimes we judge people based on their visible possessions without knowing what their financial life actually looks like. The person with the newest car may be drowning in payments. The person wearing ordinary clothes may have substantial investments. The person living in a modest apartment may own several income-producing assets. You simply can't determine someone's financial position by looking at them. So what can you take from this story? First, protect your financial privacy. You don't have to announce every investment, every raise, or every financial goal to everyone around you. Second, focus on assets rather than appearances. Third, let compounding do the heavy lifting. Fourth, keep your lifestyle under control as your financial position improves. And fifth, learn to think long-term. 13 years sounds like a long time when you're standing at the beginning. That 13 years passes whether you build something or not. The question is, what will you have at the end of those 13 years? Imagine two people starting with similar incomes. Person A spends every raise. Every time their incomes. Person A spends every raise. Every time their income increases, their car gets more expensive. Their apartment gets bigger. Their vacations become more extravagant. 13 years later, they may look extremely successful, but their net worth might not reflect it. Person B gets a raise and keeps their lifestyle mostly unchanged. They invest the difference. They acquire productive assets. They reinvest returns. They make mistakes, learn, and continue. 13 years later, their life may look almost the same from the outside, but financially, it could be completely different. That's the power of quiet compounding. And perhaps that's why this story is so compelling. The biggest transformation wasn't visible. There was no dramatic moment where he suddenly became rich. No lottery ticket, no viral business, no overnight success. Just thousands of small decisions made consistently over more than a decade. One property, one payment, one repair, one investment, one reinvestment, one more year, then another, until the invisible became impossible to ignore. 2 million, then another, and another. So the next time you see someone driving an old car, living in a modest apartment, or refusing to spend money just to impress people, don't automatically assume they're struggling. They might be, or they might simply understand something you don't yet see. And the next time you feel pressure to prove that you're successful, remember this: real wealth doesn't need to be loud. You don't need to look rich. You need to become financially resilient. You need assets. You need discipline. You need patience, and you need a plan that can survive long enough for compounding to work. A county recorder answered that question after 13 years, 2 million. Nobody saw it coming, and maybe that's the point. Sometimes the strongest financial move you can make is to stop trying to look successful and quietly start becoming successful. If this story gave you a different perspective on wealth, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more powerful financial stories and lessons. Because sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the person who has been building the strongest foundation all along.